Welcome to Rune Soup, a podcast about magic, culture, and the paranormal, coming to you from... My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. Enjoy. Today on Rune Soup, we are speaking to author, grimoire specialist, and gentleman scholar, Jake Stratton-Kent. Jake is responsible for some of the more important works of this current magical revival, including Geosophia and the Testament of Cyprian the Mage. Mr. Stratton-Kent, thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, it's a pleasure, as ever.
Very good, very good. Now, we chat reasonably often, so I know some snippets of the traditional first question already, but there are people out there who don't. So, Jake, were you a weird kid?
I still am. Yeah, very weird kid. In lots of ways. But, specifically, got into mythology and all that quite early, and didn't really fit in, got bullied for a while till I had a quiet chat with my grandfather, and then I became a bit of a terror instead. So, yeah, I didn't mind being a weird kid once that hurdle was crossed.
Right, so did your interest in things like swords and so on come from your grandfather?
He was quite a gentle guy in a way, most ways really, but it stemmed from me becoming a terror, certainly. I mean, I've got Mars in the first house and so on, and so once I discovered that quality in myself, there was no stopping it.
Understood. Now, when you say you were reading mythology, is it the classic story? I mean, we've had quite a few Brits on the show so far, and many of them seem to have grown up near surprisingly well-stocked public libraries that have even things like Crowley in them, but certainly large mythology sections. Were you, like, from a family that had these kind of books, or were you the beneficiary of an amazing public library?
A bit of both, but mostly good libraries. I mean, there was sort of Rosemary Sutcliffe, Alan Garner, and all that sort of thing on the shelves. But my dad had things like Kingsley's Heroes and so on. So yeah, I got introduced to Greek mythology particularly quite early, but bits and pieces of Celtic and Norse and so on too. But I guess the Greek's the one I picked up and ran with.
Well, that's certainly true.
Yeah. Understatement, possibly.
And had you, because I know we've discussed the Golden Bough before, was this something you read as a kid, or was this something that you sort of read later on and then kind of used and then subsequently discovered its limitations?
Early teens. Leamington Public Library had the whole sort of 13-volume set in there, so, I spent quite a while going down there and reading the whole way through it. And, like you say, eventually had to filter some of it out, especially when Ron Hutton came along and demolished not just the Golden Bough, but also the aforementioned kids' mythology books, because it was all a bit of an echo chamber.
Yeah, absolutely. So, going back to sort of, the childhood piece, what would you say was your first... No, actually, let me do this question first. Were there any kind of high strange experiences prior to, the discovery of magic? Did you live in a haunted house? Were you abducted by aliens, and so on?
I mean, ghosts were kind of a given with my family, although they were quite conventional in other ways. They've pretty much all seen ghosts, including animal ghosts. And, so did I. There was that side of things. But, I also got some strange mystery illness and spent a lot of time in hospital with everybody expecting me to die. Except me. And my paternal grandfather, who died before I was even born, kind of appeared to me and sort of told me how things were going to be and what would be the consequence of me surviving. And that was all a bit strange, and I managed to check out some of the details about his life that came from that experience, and found out they were true. So yeah, that was quite interesting. I don't recommend sort of delirium and so on, but it was definitely an interesting experience.
Was that an unusual conversation to have with your own father when you kind of came to and sort of said, "Oh, by the way, Dad says hi"?
yeah, it was a bit. I discovered that not only was he in the antediluvian order of buffaloes, but he was also a druid, and perhaps more committed to it than people might have suspected. And yeah, it all kind of checked out.
So you have accidental lineage.
Yeah, definitely accidental lineage. Yeah. I don't have a lot of sympathy for most English druids. There are honourable exceptions, but most of them are guilty till proven innocent by bitter experience. But the Cornish and Welsh ones I like. But yeah, it's a lineage of sorts, I suppose.
Right, and what was... tell the story about how you sort of first either encountered practicing magicians or first kind of encountered that this could be a real thing.
Well, it was kind of in the air in the 70s. I mean, as well as sort of Easy Rider and what have you, and youth radicalisation. There was also the mystical and magical thing, hippies getting into tarot cards and fantasy novels and all that. And some sort of riotous occasion, me and some of my friends hanging out getting drunk. One of them said something to me. I don't know why they said it, I have no idea. They said, "Jake, you've got the soul of a warrior," and it kind of hit me like a bolt of lightning. And I was like, God, yeah, that makes sense. That's who I am. That's why I am like this. And where do I go next? And for some bizarre reason, I decided that magician was the next thing. I mean, if I've been a warrior in all these previous lives, perhaps now I've realised that I need to go somewhere else. It all seemed quite logical at the time. I mean, looking back, it's quite bizarre. But mastering witchcraft was laying around, and I picked it up and started working my way through it. Reading it, using it, looking at the bibliography and thinking, well, I could get that. So, that's pretty much where it all started, just a bolt from the blue realisation that it was what I was meant to be doing.
It is something that was... does appear to have been in the air at the time, and as you said, like the same, and in subsequent years as well, like moving into Thatcher years. What I find interesting about the sort of British experience of magic is that it is intertwined with a lot of activism that was going on, that I know you've had some experience with yourself. There was that movie that came out about what was it called? The movie that came out about the Welsh mining town in the came out last year.
Pride?
That was it.
Yeah, great movie, and I could identify with a lot of the events and feelings in that. That was very. I was a bit later on in my life, but that was happening, but not too much later. The Thatcher era, and which was a bizarre era. I mean, we knew what we were up against, but at the same time, things were a lot freer at the time. I think society's got more restrictive since than it ever was then. So looking back, it was a kind of golden age. Although people think the 70s was dreadful, it really wasn't. We had an identifiable enemy for a start.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. You could at least see the whites of her sunken eyes. It's interesting you say that, because it's a discussion I have with a few other people in an ongoing sense. The change is that there's a self-policing, and also the kind of the surveillance structure, the ever-present technological monitoring, so that even if the odds did not seem that great before, you could at least... There is a sense of autonomy or freedom in it, where you can be talking to people in the pub and realise, prior to 2004, for instance, you wouldn't be recorded, but now you are. Yeah.
Well, yeah, some of the sort of Trotskyist groups and what have you at the time, their places were totally bugged, and sort of probably 1 in 5 of them was an infiltrator. But yeah, that aside, there was a lot more freedom. The margins were wider. You know, there was room for the free festival movement and alternative society and so on, rather than sort of doing it all in your living room on the computer. You actually get out and meet people and have a life with them. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think there was a kind of economic space for it as well. There's something Pete Carroll wrote a couple of months ago in the blog, which was when he first moved to London, you could squat for a start because everywhere was run down. So you could get you could squat in Kensington, let alone the sort of fringes of London, and the sort of the social welfare net was sufficient to actually be able to live on. So it generated this kind of fringe cultural space, and he was writing about it, remarking that is not the case with London now. It's you must have 1 million and up to apply.
No, it's vanished, and it wasn't all the social welfare net either. I mean, while I was squatting, I didn't sign on. It was easy enough to survive. You could go down to the market or whatever when it was closing down. There was loads of free food available. And derelict buildings, you could get fuel and stuff easily enough. I ended up self-sufficient enough to provide other people without drawing on the state at all.
And
you can't do that now. They've made you dependent and then tell you off for it.
Well, you can't buy food that's going to be thrown out now. I remember you used to know the marketing director for Pret, and they do the sort of handing out. They give the sandwiches at the end of the day to the homeless, and she said it was an absolute nightmare to actually get the legalities of that sorted, because you're supposed to throw it out. You're supposed to throw it into the bin next to a homeless person.
Yeah. And even places like public dumps and so on, you're not allowed to pick up usable furniture and things. That's all criminalised. It's quite an absurd situation. So the margins have effectively vanished. Literally, lay-bys have been removed in large areas of the country, so you can't park up overnight, stuff like that. People don't realise how much freedom we've lost in the intervening period from the 70s.
What's the solution for that, do you think? Is it a political one, or do you have to find a margin further out?
Well, there are still niches here and there, but I think socio-economic disaster could actually be a good thing if they couldn't afford to police us anymore. And we were able to become self-sufficient and a bit more community-spirited. A lot of people would probably kick me for saying so, but a downturn might actually be a good thing.
Well, the community spirit does tend to roar to life when the money runs out for state infrastructure. The famous examples are, long-running blackouts in cities like Auckland or New York. If they last more than 5 days, all of a sudden people start talking to each other and checking on their neighbors, and it's an innate part of mankind that we seem to have had interrupted by this infrastructure. Yeah,
definitely. Yeah, I'd welcome it. Yeah, even though I'm getting on, I'd be prepared to rough it for the quality of life rather than the standard of living, I think. But that's the way it is at the moment, and I'm surviving quite happily, and always have done.
Well, yeah. One of the things I remember we were talking about. I think we were talking about Lovecraft or the Necronomicon or something at one stage, and you were mentioning when you were living in Wales last time, or one of the times. We're talking about there was a sort of would have been a really good water temple. There was this rundown building on the end of a pier, I think, correctly. Was this?
That's the one. Yeah.
So let's talk. You were from the Midlands originally. Let's do that's right, isn't it? You're from.
Well, I grew up there. Yeah. My family were a bit itinerant. We had East End connections and all sorts, but I ended up growing up in the Midlands. Yeah. Before I hit the road at 14.
Tell that story then. Yeah.
Well, I went to Wales, the place you're talking about, from the Wally squats. We were realising that we weren't going to be living there forever. I had to look for other options. We heard about this deserted village up in North Wales. There's a slate mining industry. There's a big pier there where they used to ship the slate out from. And the pier was quite robust on some of it. And there was this concrete hut set at just a perfect angle to never get wet. It was actually dusty inside, although waves could break over it in storms. You could keep a library in there without it getting wet, which I did, of course. So yeah, that was my haunt in the mid-70s. Was in this wonderful deserted village, with beaches going on forever, cliffs, fairly friendly locals, despite the way the Welsh are portrayed sometimes. Like they didn't mind us being there in the main. We were outsiders, but obviously, sort of ex-English sort of thing. And they were quite welcoming when we actually did contact them. So, yeah, we had a little community up there for a while. And various other people, I think Sid Rolls and various other counterculture types had tried setting up a community there previously.
Gotcha.
So, yeah, I was very much living that kind of life at the time, itinerant, rogue and a vagabond, and loved every minute of it.
And this was more or less...
Lots of opportunities to practice magic too, of course. Yeah.
Well, can you give some examples of itinerant magic that spring to mind?
Well, this is another thing that comes up in one of Pete Carroll's books, isn't it? If your life is comfortable enough to do this magical routine easily, then make it more difficult. And yeah, the itinerant lifestyle. There's plenty of opportunities for chaos, and change. It's not entirely predictable. Plus, occasionally you need stuff, or your friends need stuff. So there's reasons to do magic which aren't pure self-aggrandizement. They're survival as much as anything else.
And I think that chaos is good because you get the disasters are potentially larger, but you also get the higher highs as well, as you say. If you're kind of in a highly unpredictable life, then you don't get the sort of modern magical success results like, oh, I got a 0.5% pay rise. It's more like, oh, I found a bunch of antiques in this old house that I sold, and I made a bunch of money. Yeah,
that's the sort of thing. And yeah, it's some old-fashioned witchcraft, cures and things. They can become more useful. Like if you can't afford medicine, or you're miles away from any doctor, and your friend gets a toothache, you can pull this stuff out of the old grimoires and improvise, which I did. I mean, when we were living out in the wilderness in Wales, my friend got a terrible toothache. And I found a sheep's tooth and got the root of a piece of grass and found these magic words to cure toothache in one of the books I had. And I just put a spell together, wrapped it up in tinfoil and said, here, so put that behind the tooth. And it worked. His toothache went away until he could get treatment, which was quite remarkable, really. I mean, usually I was giving him some clove oil, but we didn't have anything like that.
So when you say these were some of the books you had during your itinerant phase, one of the questions I've got for later, but I'm going to jump in now, was after mastering witchcraft, in what direction did you head?
Well, some of Paul Hewson's obvious preferences became mine. I mean, rhyming ritual and things like that. So witchy stuff always appealed to me, but I also sort of deviated into Crowley and what have you. But my favourite Crowley ritual happens to be in rhyme. And so yeah, I explored quite a lot of areas, and eventually realised that what I was trying to do was get a kind of overview of the entire subject, because it needed putting back together again in quite a big way.
Well, that it did. I mean, where did the tooth charm come from?
Some there was lots more compendiums of spells and things around at that time. Cheap paperbacks which had just collected it from everywhere. And I think I can remember the magic words of like Gilbees, Gilbat, something along those lines. And it was just in this compendium of witchcraft and spells, and happened to be apropos and useful at the time.
Nice one. So, what was the sort of grimoire situation like at the time? I mean, what I find interesting about that, especially if you're itinerant and carrying a bunch of books around, is the sort of 17th and up century grimoires were quite unfashionable at the time, thanks to the Mathers crowd and so on. I mean, were they readily available? And when you started to encounter them, was it kind of a love at first sight thing?
Yeah, it's always been a bit of a love-hate thing, really. I mean, I can't get away from the grimoires, but there are things I don't especially like about them. But Mather's Keir Solomon, I managed to somehow get the pennies together for that. But otherwise, it was Idris Shah's Secret Law of Magic in paperback. It was fairly new and easily available at the time. So, that's good. I mean, it's got most of the Grimoire Verum, the Grand Grimoire, Honorius, lots of the Keir Solomon and other bits. Albertus Magnus for herbal and stone lore. So, for a single paperback, had a lot of information and that you could test drive.
And is that where the interest in it come from? You actually were doing them? The reason I ask is when I was first kind of going through my books and experiment phase here in Australia as a teenager, the opinion of Solomonic grimoires in the published authors that at least I had access to was quite low. It was obviously an opinion formed by people who clearly hadn't really even cracked one of the books and had an attempt at it. But it was this kind of idea that it's some kind of it is Christian, but they meant it in a proper Christian sense, and it was this sort of silly old thing. And I'm just wondering, at what stage, I mean, was that different for you when you first encountered the grimoires, where you're like, well, goodness, there's something to this? Because it took me to read past that and actually have a go with some of them. And then, funnily enough, I credit things like the Simonomicon for giving me the training wheels to go, well, okay, that one worked. I might try an actual one. But I was reading up through people who had some fairly low opinions of the Solomonic books.
Yeah, I encountered that as well. Yeah, but somehow or another, and possibly because I was, semi-crazy, juvenile delinquent, I was like, how do they know? They're dismissing stuff without trying it. Maybe you don't have to understand it. Maybe you actually have to do it and figure it out from there, rather than coming to a priori conclusions, which in retrospect was quite a smart move on my part. But quite how I formed that, I don't know really, because I wasn't that discerning. And I'm not putting myself down. I think actually you have to experiment and go crazy a bit. If you start young, that's exactly what's going to happen. But at least you've got time to learn and unlearn. So I encountered snotty opinions and thought, no, they don't know what they're talking about because they haven't done it. And plus, Paul Hewson is sympathetic enough to the grimoires. He includes bits of them. And in his other great book, The Devil's Picture book, there's obviously a lot of traditional magic in there too. So, Keir Solomon is a bit daunting. I still don't really like the incantations in there. I like my conjurations to have a bit more oomph and passion, and flavour appropriate to the task, rather than Solomonic flavour all the bloody time.
Yeah, vanilla ice cream every time. Yeah. So things like the pick of tricks, the conjurations. If you're conjuring Venus, there's Venusian imagery and language, and same for Mars, and so on. Whereas with Solomon, it's like Solomonic flavour, which is puts me to sleep. So
So
when you
I was ready to pick and mix a bit.
Yeah. Well, interestingly, when you were saying, going a bit crazy and having a go at it when you were young, were you largely self-taught? I mean, is there a mentor that you menteed under way back in the day?
Not for quite some time, really. Not till about 1982, when I encountered Jim Lee's group, the late Jim Lee's. And I thought, hey, these guys are actually a bit ahead of me. The questions I've been asking, they've actually sort of got experimental programs up and running. Everybody else was dismissing astrology, whereas I thought, it's very important traditionally. And they were using astrological timing and doing other things, which I was very impressed by. Them making their own swords, growing herbs, enough herbs in fact to make paper out of. Beautiful paper made by hand, out of the Book of the Law. And I just thought, this is. I've not been a joiner up till now, but maybe it's time. So for at least around 10 years, I guess. I'd been solo, but. That changed when I encountered that particular group.
And how did you encounter them? Were they? Was it more of that kind of West Country conspiracy, or where were you at the time?
I was in the West Country. Squatting, and I discovered mail order occult services and so on, and through that I discovered chaos magic and the new equinox that Ray Sherwin was running at the time. And it came about that Ray was ready to hand over the new equinox. Initially, he asked me if I was interested, but he must have been talking to Jim around the same time. And Jim took it on, so I said, I got in touch with Jim and said, hey, do you want to write her? And the ball started rolling from there. I just discovered what he was actually doing, and like I say, I was impressed.
Well, it's in a funny way, it's coming back round again. As you know, I mean, we chatted earlier. Kath Thompson's got an English Kabbalah book coming out imminently in the next week or so, depending on when this episode comes out.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing it. When the postman realises that my place actually does exist and that he can deliver it. I know Kath of old, obviously. We were members of the same group at the same time back then.
Well,
I'm looking forward to seeing it.
Yeah, me too. I mean, it's a clever idea that when I think about it's actually quite a dynamic way of using that sort of thelemic ideas that were in the book that no one had actually previously done. But it also seems to be an indicator of that experimental vibrancy you were just talking about. I didn't realize they were doing clever arts and crafts things like making paper and swords, but it's people kind of really getting the balance right between going deep into the material but also experimenting and pushing its edges. Crowley was a genius, but there's projects that he never finished. I mean, some he hardly started, and some had actually gone into reverse with his successors, and so on. So, I was all over that. And there's English Kabbalah's only one potential project that was in the air and still is, but that one, they picked it up and ran with it, and rather than sit around making a priori objections to it, which I eventually had to deal with when I became sort of spokesman for the movement, because Jim was hermiting, and I thought it needed to get out there, so I ended up taking over the journal from him and ran an online forum for quite a few years. And the amount of objections, it can't possibly work, or why shouldn't we all come up with our own? And I was like, well, you can. I'll even examine some of them for you if you like. But this one is actually up and running, and the a priori objections are hogwash, and we have actually considered them before you mentioned them. People have got less and less willing to experiment. Well, that was going to be my next question. I mean, what What is that? What is the version of that for today? Because it does seem that the Museum of Magic has returned.
It does, yeah. Yeah, I mean, and in some areas that I dearly love, there's like another side of the fence, or a fence running right down the middle of several of them, and not necessarily in the middle either. I mean, grimoires being one. There's some aspects of that current are becoming very, very rigid.
Or polarized
or not
too.
free thinking. Yeah, very polarized.
Which, well, funnily enough, let's talk about that. What even are the grimoires?
Well, yeah, that's a funny subject because I mean the word grimoire actually only appears in the title of very few magical books, and they're usually the ones that the purists are sniffy about. Yeah, like the Grimoire Verum, Grand Grimoire, Grimoire of Honorius, Grimoire of Armadale. That's the big four that have got grimoire actually in the title. And virtually all of them have been dismissed by the sort of aristocratic or classical Solomonic types as that's vulgarized or whatever, or that's very late. Well, actually, the Grimoire Verum looks like it's actually considerably older than the first printed edition. It's got a lineage. You can trace huge chunks of it back to the Hygromantia. So, yeah, it is thoroughly authentic in many ways. Although the published editions we first knew about are late, it looks more like being a primary resource for stuff that we haven't actually been aware of. So, but yeah, people are sniffy about it. There's folk magic in it. Oh, folk magic's no good. Oh, there's pacts in it. Oh, I found the word pacts in the Key of Solomon today. In the preparations for one of the rituals, if there's pacts involved, do this. If there's words involved, do that. I thought, that's pacts in the Key of Solomon. I mean, they say, only the black magicians using these vulgar late grimoires do pacts. But there it is in the text. So it's like people go blind when they're looking at the stuff they approve of and don't realise that this stuff actually does overlap hugely. They can't say, "Well, don't like this. That's typical of that area. It's not typical of my area." When sorry, it is. Perhaps you've sanitised it too much and wearing some blinkers.
So, when did you? I mean, it's certainly going back in time easier to have found. Basically any of the ones that Mathers put out, like Armadale or so on. When did you kind of realize the overlap? Like, actually the Spirit List has some recurring names from an earlier document, and you just mentioned the Hygromantia. I did not get access to it until the one that, now Dr. Skinner had published. When did you start to realize, wait a minute, there is something about and even the low ones in particular, but there's something about the grimoires and the Spirit Lists that seems to have historical antecedent?
Well, that's grown and grown over time. I mean, you get people like A. Waite saying, such and such a grimoire seems to have chosen the wackiest spells, and they're not typical of the genre at all. Talking about the ritual to get three ladies to appear in your room. And so that's derived from the Sibylline tradition, and virtually identical rituals and references can be found in the Hygromantia. It's not late, and it's not a foreigner to the tradition. It's always been there.
No, I mean, when did you work at it? Was this because you were such a mythology nerd as a kid that you're reading through this stuff going, well, actually, that reminds me of blah, or, Well,
yeah. Yeah, I did get into it fairly early on, and it's been a work in progress, so some of my earlier conclusions I don't necessarily stand by, but they led me in an interesting direction. So, the idea that some of the demons were descended from pagan gods, I think has probably been a bit overstated, but at the same time gets you looking in the interesting areas. And for me, it's the nexus between the Hellenistic era and the early church, early Christian era. It is really where it's happening. I don't think there's ancient Sumerian deities in the grimoires, but I do think there are late pagan deities in there, one way or another, or late pagan models even, like the decans and so on. Yeah, and academics, in their own way, say much the same. Kaikhefer, Causiumblicus, like the grandfather of the spiritualists, virtually. This whole hierarchy of spirits idea, you can trace right the way back to him.
Yeah, he's one of my favorites. What I find interesting about the sort of the history of magic, as in the study of the history of magic, is many of these conclusions or assertions, same thing with the Hermetica, have kind of come through out of sequence, and I find it hilarious. So that the quote-unquote rediscovery of Hermeticism in the Renaissance made them think it was, Egyptian, and then, we had Casaubon saying it wasn't, and then that survived quite a while. And what's fascinating about the sort of historical research that's gone on in the last, say, 15 or so years, is it turns out that people like Iamblichus were more right than they are wrong, and there's been this kind of funny elevation and of their attitudes to theurgy and all that kind of stuff. I love it. I love the fact that we kind of deviated as a discourse, and then we came back, and whilst they're still wrong about a bunch of stuff, they end up being a lot more correct than we'd previously credited them.
Oh yeah, and obviously Casaubon had an axe to grind anyway. But yeah, there's thoroughly Egyptian elements in Hermeticism. The texts may not be all that old, but you look at some of the stuff in the PGM, and there are pre-dynastic traditions reflected in later forms.
Well, that's absolutely true, and I think that's where a more nuanced understanding of the history is correct. So, whilst there aren't Sumerian deities in the sort of more common or more popular spirit lists, there are spirits there that have an overlap with classical gods that originally did come from Sumeria. So you have these layers of it. But if people are looking for Marduk in the grimoires, they're not going to find it.
No, but they will find Baal in a more solar pantheistic sort of late Roman sort of form, and he's obviously got antecedents, but the form in which he influenced the tradition is essentially late pagan rather than prehistoric. But the lines go back. They are ultimately the same spirits adopting new guises in various cultural eras.
So, I mean, that's quite a good question. We're halfway to it anyway. What are the spirits, Jake?
I don't like to put them in boxes because
just pots.
The boxes tend to break.
Yeah.
But I do think Goetia emerges almost fully formed from prehistoric times in the late Bronze Age, and obviously there are traditions going back further. Stories have been told around campfires long before the Phoenicians gave the Greeks a few letters. So,
indeed, and it's a not chicken and the egg, but it depends which. I think anyway. This is my read on it. It depends how you want to decide which thing comes first, right? So, if you look at the Testament of Solomon, it's quite clearly a Eastern Mediterranean Deccan system in its bones. That's there. Yeah. Okay, fine. So. Does that mean it came from the Decans? Well, where did the Decans come from? So which thing do you want to put first? Did the spirits told around the campfires become the Decans that were then used as the bones for whatever was going on that the Testament of Solomon matches as a magical practice? Or, you see what I mean? Which piece do you say came first? They say, well, it clearly came from the Decans. That's fine. Where did those spirits come from? And I find that interesting that there's like a two North Pole magnet situation. You try to put them together and they bounce because you can't. Which thing you put first in a sequence is kind of personal. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And so, in some ways, I think, and this reflects on the earlier parts of the conversation, it doesn't matter if your initial theory is crazy, as long as you're running with it. So is it the deckhands or not? Well, yeah, it's the stars and the stories you're telling around the campfire. You're still pointing at the constellations and the story, and as you tell the story, and seeing the images of the gods in the sky before you've even got writing, or math, or particularly accurate mathematics, even. Although their math was probably accurate for the location they lived in, but they didn't have a world table of houses or anything like that, which we consider essential to computations now. But yeah, the spirits, we're here and out there at the same time. The Earth goddess, for want of a better word, Demeter, has her own constellation. Subterranean deities even have constellations. Hephaestus, the volcano god, and all these others. There were numerous natural experiences and the rituals that evolve around them. But the stories could be told on the basis of something totally systemic, which is the movements of the stars and the patterns of the stars, which is exterior to us. Obviously, it's an exterior order. It's not something that's purely humanly created. It's out there to relate to.
All right.
Yeah, that's how the spirit. That's how we get the stories of the spirits, and how they keep coming back is because the stars haven't gone away for a start.
Yeah, so they were called different things before we call them spirits now. They will presumably be called something else in subsequent centuries, assuming life on Earth survives. And they're an agglomeration of. They're star lore. They're spirits associated with stars. They're the occasional god and local monster. It is words we have for that engagement with the spirit worlds around place.
Yeah, Crowley nicked Max Muller's expression and said that magic is a disease of language. But yes, it is. But also, no, it's not. There's more to it. Language is a handle on it, really. And the language changes, the language evolves, but it's also the vehicle of consciousness and ideas. So language is hugely important, even if the magical tradition predates the literary tradition. There's still an oral tradition. You're still dealing with language. And obviously the god of magic is usually the god of writing as well, in lots of cultures. And we have spells and grammars and so on.
Nice. So, what even is Goetia then? Let's move on from spirits to Goetia.
Yeah, well, I like the term Goetia. It's been devalued or demonized, which is quite an appropriate word in a lot of ways. It can be translated directly as witchcraft. Although lots of witches would run a mile rather than say they were doing Goetic magic, but you say witchcraft in Greek, it's Goetia. It is a more primitive form of magic. It's not been dolled up by philosophers. Once it becomes dolled up by philosophers, it changes its name. It becomes theurgy and so on. So Goetia is the more primitive, primal end of it, which is also in a lot of ways the more real end of it. This is beyond what man can pretty it up to be. This is the continuous line and the root of things, which goes back to the origin of mythology in prehistory. So Goetia is always older than whatever fashionable system is going around. It's darker. The gods aren't moral forces personified. They can be quite arbitrary and unpredictable. Earlier on, the word daemon could mean Zeus as well as the ghost of your granny or a drowned sailor, or anything in between. Daemon was a very ambiguous and all-encompassing word. So, the gods were originally demons, but once they become gods and get nice, clean, laundered robes and start personifying moral forces, or gods. Gods become like equivalents of kings and judges and landlords and so on. There's this more primitive conception which is more real. And magic is ultimately amoral, as we should hopefully all know. Doesn't mean we have to be immoral, but magic is neutral, and the gods can be on either side of that line, depending where you need to be for the survival of your tribe or for the task in hand or whatever. It's a much less circumscribed idea, and more true. I mean, I'm not a great believer in karma. Sort of bad people often do very well. Good people often don't. Natural disasters, affect people regardless of their status or their good and bad deeds. That's how life is, and magic deals with life as it is, rather than how we'd like it to be printed up to be in a Disney-fied sort of way. So Goetia faces up to reality, and it doesn't prettify it. It's up to us to decide what the rules we live by are.
Well, absolutely. That's reflected in the mythology that you'd be reading as a kid. The world is essentially arbitrary. The gods are fickle. Fate is fickle.
Yeah, and that is the original idea always. It's only once we start having states and stratified society and so on that we start pretending that there must be rules. That the gods have laid down and obey themselves. And Jupiter is the ultimate arbiter of justice, rather than someone who goes around turning into animals and raping nymphs.
Yeah, that comes with the state. You have to be, if you want to tell someone to do things, you have to pretend that someone higher than you has told them as well. That's the promise of playing by the rules, and it's highly manipulative and doesn't quite match the phenomena very well. That's
right, and that's why I hold on to Goetia as a truer word, and the darker aspects of the grimoires are often more true to their originals and can tell you more about where it came from and actually how it really works. The necessity of a go-between in Goetic conjuring is also true of mythology. There has to be this trickster or vice-regent figure that interconnects the worlds in order for mythology to happen and in order for magic to happen. And Goetia holds on to that, whereas a lot of modern occultists have got absolutely no frigging conception of it. Even when they've seen it written down, they don't remember seeing it. They pick up other little details and here and there and miss this great central narrative.
So, this is a bit of a trick question. It kind of ties into what we were just saying there. And I know this is really a bit of a mean thing to ask, but which is your favorite grimoire? That's the trick question. And why? Is it... Yeah, no, go. And I'll answer the second part of ask the second part of the question once you've done that bit.
Well, it's always been the Grimoirium Verum, really. Yeah. Absolutely no question about it. I can say it without a second's thought. It's always been the Grimoirium Verum. I haven't always known why. It was probably initially instinctive, but the instinct ultimately proved good.
Yeah, so the shape and the language appeals to you, but what I guess the second half of the question, or my assumption is, it is also the text that you can hold up for the thesis you've just described.
Mm-hmm. Well, you can hold other ones up as well, much more respectable ones, like Abramelin, for instance. You've got the Holy Guardian Angel as the important intermediary figure without whom none of the magic works. And and you can spot the same principle in living traditions of magic rather than fragmented literary ones. it's very easy to spot sort of Legba and Papa Bones and Eshu and various other characterizations in the African traditional religions. This absolutely vital intermediary figure who has to be conjured first before you can talk to any of the others.
So with the Verum, it was some of it must have been aesthetic. I mean, some of it would have been on their side.
Oh
as
yeah,
well.
Totally aesthetic originally. It spoke to me. That's all I can say. I mean, there was a visceral reaction. It's like, God, there's something about this I really, really like. And the bits and pieces took a while to fall together. And it's like, well, yeah, actually, yeah, it does really have something. I didn't know initially that actually the Grimoire Verum is a particular kind of version of the Key of Solomon. I thought, like many other people, that it's a completely different book. There weren't enough versions of the Key of Solomon knocking around to draw any other conclusion, but there is now. It's obviously very closely related to the Lansdowne, a couple of manuscripts, Lansdowne and Welcome, but also much earlier ones like the one JHP is working on at the moment.
No, when you say...
the line... I couldn't tell you initially what was attractive about it. It just was very attractive.
And thinking about, say, the Encyclopedia Goetica, so the three Scarlet books, True Grimoire, Geosophia, and Testament of Cyprian, did you know at the beginning that if you kind of pushed on this door, it would open up into this sort of... enormous project behind it? Was the EG kind of formed in your head from the beginning?
No, it kind of emerged as I went along. I thought initially, I can just have an appendix about the Greeks. And as you know, I ended up writing a book twice the size of True Grimoire instead, because I really couldn't. But yeah, it was once I started researching the True Grimoire in real depth, like enough to try and explain it to other people, other things started coming out of the woodwork. And it's the same with Testament of Cyprian as well. I thought once I finished with Geosophia, I thought I need some time off now. And then Cyprian came along, and I thought, wow, I've got to engage with this. and no rest for the wicked, get on with it. So yeah, it kind of grew organically. And good books, I think, are always like that. You end up knowing more about the subject by writing it than you did when you set out. More of the pieces fit together better.
Yeah, they do. Well, this is the next question then. In the course of, particularly from sort of Geosophia and especially Cyprian, what was the thing you found that surprised you the most?
Oh, well, that is a good question. Well, there's quite a few things, really. With Cyprian, it was the way he's so ubiquitous. I mean, he fits in the late pagan world in the aforesaid Mediterranean sphere, but then he gets into the grimoire area on the other side of the Mediterranean and up in Scandinavia, and then he crosses the Atlantic into the New World, and I was like, good God, this guy's actually bigger than Solomon, and nobody knows about him. With due deference to those people speaking other languages who probably did. But it's like the whole occult scene has virtually overlooked him, and he's absolutely massive. And that tied a lot of threads together, like the True Grimoire thread. I mean, he's actually mentioned in the Grand Grimoire, which is the close relative, just in passing, but he's there. And yeah, I also grew to recognise how limited the Anglophone occult revival had been up till then. We'd been like in a little bubble. Some of the German occult revival had filtered in through Crowley's links with the OTO and previously maybe the Golden Dawn. But basically, it was all happening in the English language and the Protestant world, and was a huge echo chamber. Well, actually, not that huge. Once you start to realise there's all this Portuguese stuff, there's all this Spanish stuff, and the Scandinavian stuff. So it's a much, much bigger picture, and that we'd been virtually ignoring. Stuck in our little echo chamber, thinking, "Oh, the occult revival's got all the answers. We don't need to look anywhere else." That surprised me and daunted me, really, because my linguistic skills are very, very minor. But I was lucky enough to get contacts in Brazil and elsewhere who were happy to help me out and do a bit of translating for me or check out what I'd done. So, yeah, lots of doors opened for me. Lots and lots of doors. But, yes, the Anglophone echo chamber thing, I didn't really appreciate before I started.
Gotcha. So, on what is the next area of, I guess, importance or relevance for the, scholar magicians of the world?
Well, Urs has let the cat out of the bag on that one. The next project is called Pandemonium, and is a kind of concordance, not an exhaustive one by any means, but a kind of concordance of several major spirit catalogues and how they interrelate, particularly how some of the key characters are present, unsuspected in some cases, in a huge swathe of the genre, and possibly in areas I haven't tapped yet too. The dramatis personae has grown, and it's quite extensive. We're not looking at 72 spirits, we're looking at quite a lot more. The upper hierarchy is quite a bit bigger than we suspect as well. And so that's what this current project is about.
What does that tell us?
Schematic in some ways.
Yeah, what does that tell us about? I mean, we're sort of talking 1300s Central Europe, a bit before as well. But like, what does that tell us? The fact that there are some names that are conserved across several centuries, but the wider literary evidence has either been lost or not yet discovered, at least, a high volume of it. But what does that kind of imply about the role of spirits and their kind of relationship to magic and esotericism in the Low and then High Middle Ages? What does it say that there are conserved, at least some conserved parts of the list through time like that?
Yeah, there's quite a few implications and quite a few grey areas. Like I say, this is not exhaustive. It's going to be a work in progress even when I finished it. It does kind of reinforce the theme that there was a big picture, probably predating the grimoires, and related to the decans stroke lunar mansions as part of a world picture or a cosmogram or whatever you want to call it, with key players who aren't just like important characters. They also have a definite role in the process, like intermediary figures of one kind or another. Some of them specific, some of them general. And so some of it relates to grimoire processes as practiced or envisaged, and that changes. There's no sort of grimoire. There's lots of contradictions, although there's also some very strong themes, like characters remain important even if the picture is slightly different, or even very different. You still find that these same guys at the top. Examples of how different it can be. You look closely at the Goetia's timing rules, the Goetia of Solomon, that is, rather than Goetia the subject. It's mostly looking at daylight hours. Different parts of the day, morning, sort of noon, and so on, are the right times, RITE, for particular spirits. But you go to the Grand Grimoire and the Grimoire of Honorius, and same spirits have been conjured at hours of the night. So all the modus operandi and various other things can be quite different, but these same central characters dominate the narrative. So, yeah, we can reconstruct our favourite grimoires methods by having a more informed look at the catalogue, but it's not telling us about an system that underlies all of them. And I don't want it to, and it won't. It can't.
No. So let's play a little bit of historical fiction then. Not Trithemius himself, but what would an educated person in his time? I mean, as you say, the grimoires not use that as a word, is not used that often and later than Trithemius. But what would they have? What would have been their worldview of the spirits? It wouldn't be that there's a book. There would probably not be an understanding that they are a survival of things like the Decans and so on, kind of knocked around through the Eastern Med and then up through Central Europe. What for me, I'm just going to kind of put words out there so that there's a bit more context for your answer. It seems to me that the conservation of some of the names in the catalogue through time, not just the names, but the conservation of some of the forms in the catalogue through time, suggests that the thing that persisted through history was an awareness that there were these beings that, if you're a little bit dodgy, and as long as the local priest wasn't looking, there are ways to get in contact with them.
Well, it might have been the local priest that was doing it, of course.
Well, very often, yeah.
Well, I'm not suggesting that they were all deeply read in Greek and Latin, or that they were brilliant astrologers or so on. More that some of the patterns had come from people who were at an earlier period, and somehow or another had survived. And enough of the results from whatever they did understand led them to preserve parts of the hierarchy as a necessary part of ritual. We need to talk to this guy in order to get these other guys to listen to us. Whether or not they understood what direction they were attributed to, or why they were called the Prince of the Air, or whatever. That's not important. They didn't have to be that well informed. They just had to be experimenting with a dodgy book.
Yeah.
And find the bits that worked actually did kind of depend on some of these elements being retained.
And I think we underestimate today, because we're so poorly read in the church fathers and that kind of thing, that there was, and this is, I think, why there is conservation of ritual practice, but otherwise sort of mutation through the centuries and book to book, even within the same century, is you have theological proof that these things are there, that they are part of creation. You're told in no uncertain terms, in church on Sunday to leave them alone, but that's the bit that I think people, the fact that that Europe did retain a spirit world rather than an ur grimoire, I think is a very, very compelling idea.
Oh yeah. That's more how I see it. I mean, the literary tradition is just one of the ways in which it survived, and in which we can access it. It's not the whole story at all. I'd be very disappointed if it was.
Yeah, if it turns out there's one book that it'll be in a library in Venice because they took it from Byzantium, and you go, damn it, there actually is one book.
There's not a lot of sign of that, fortunately. I mean, the catalogues have been varying for quite a long time, but retaining certain characteristics. Sometimes not even the names are that important, it's the roles.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people do. Even if they don't admit it, they are looking for an grimoire or a Yuba system, and I don't think it really exists. I mean, there was always regional variations and so on, and they'd have to be. I mean, if they're related to natural phenomenon or location or whatever, there's going to be variations of necessity. and that's fine. That's actually helpful rather than an obstacle. Although trying to trace the golden thread, it can get confusing. But on a more immediate level, it's actually immensely useful that it's adaptable and that variations are part of the picture.
Yes, it's very empowering once you realise what it is you're tracking through history, and it isn't an X marks the spot or grimoire. It's the persistence of a European spirit world. That is, and this kind of funnily enough comes back to that extremely polarized grimoire community ongoing debate about people who are very, shall we say, high Catholic about it, and on the other side, to be fair, people who are too free and easy with it because there are parts that are conserved for a reason. But it's very empowering when you realize what you should be looking back in history for is a spirit world rather than a recipe, rather than a sort of 10-step approach that began
the right
somewhere.
set of tools and so on. Very much so. I like a stripped down set of tools, which is another thing I like about the true grimoire, and I think it actually says that this is definitely a working magician's notes rather than a compilation. Is that every tool in there has a reason. You can see in the processes he describes. I need this today. I need these items to do that, and there's nothing in there that doesn't seem to have any purpose at all.
Well, that's a good question. I mean, you've obviously thought about true grimoire more than probably anyone alive. Do you have a sense of like the personality of who actually wrote it in the first place, or compiled it, if you will?
Well, my preferred edition is definitely the Alibek edition, and I don't suppose there was an Alibek, the Egyptian, any more than various other sort of rabbis and kings are responsible. But whoever did put that edition together knew what they were doing, and it's been shown by a couple of authorities on Austin Spare that he'd actually read the true grimoire, probably via Waite, before he came up with his theory of sigils. So that, again, is the Alibek edition that's doing the business there. So, whoever put that book together is an unsung hero, and ultimately an anonymous one, because it's got to be a pseudonym.
Well, yeah, but was he... I mean, we're just speculating now. Everyone, let's be clear about that. Was he like a Dr. Rudd, I mean, was he a country doctor? Was he a seminary dropout? I mean, do you have a sense of the personality of whoever compiled it, having looked at it for so long?
He was a lot more concise than Dr. Rudd.
Yeah, that is a large book. Yeah. Yeah, and I think he had much more of a clue how the hierarchy works. I mean, Rudd's got an idea that there's missing bits and tries to make up for it, but I think he makes a bit of a hash of it here and there. Whereas Alibek, and various other exponents of the Grand Grimoire and the True Grimoire, they'd come to similar conclusions to myself. The Eastern hierarchy is in better shape, and in any case is, in lots of ways, more useful. And so, as the other bits are a bit mangled, let's focus on that. And that's what they did. They took what we might call the Oriens part of the family and made that pretty much the spirits they were working with, but a few others here and there, which it's taken me a long time to realise was pretty much the state of the art at the time, and even now to a large extent. We've got access to more manuscripts and so on, but yeah, they had good instincts. The way the grimoires put together, they obviously knew what they were doing much more than Rudd did, I think. Rudd might have been more literate and more comfortable, but Alibek and co were definitely practitioners and really knew their subject very well. And do you think they were practitioners out of... It's interesting you say that. Were they practitioners out of, well, necessity when it's needed to be there, but also out of intellectual interest, rather than in the kind of Dr. Rudd side of things. And I actually really quite like the book, so I just want to be clear. It's just I used him as an example because you definitely get a sense of his personality in the book.
Yeah, I can see why Rudd did some of the things he did, and I actually sympathise with some of it. But at the same time, Alan Beck is more my kind of guy.
Yeah, and is that because it's obviously someone who is magically operant who put it together, but is it someone who is intellectually interested in how this might work or why this works, so that there's rather than a looking back textually, it's almost like an experiential thing about, well, this appears to be a system of some sort. Like I'm trying to get a sense of whether you've zeroed in on his personality.
It's hard to, because harking back a bit, we've had this sort of Anglophone-centred occultism for quite a while, and the idea that there might have been a previous occult revival in France and perhaps Italy as well, probably simultaneously, has kind of passed us by. And we know that there was this sort of French literary phenomena, including Huysmans and so on. And before that, there was the Chambre d'Ardente or whatever. Scandals in the aristocracy practicing black magic with the help of clerics and so on. But then you get the blue grimoires, which are aimed solidly at the lower classes. There's a much more democratic thing going on in exactly the same part of the world, not too much later. And all of this is happening before Elvis Levi. So was he a sorcerer working for the rich, or was he a bit of a Republican revolutionary? It's hard to pin down because the context is still quite broad.
Yeah, it's
and we haven't been looking at it closely enough.
No. It's a tantalizing thought. I like the idea of seeing the personality of these people come through. I think it's it adds a richness and context, and it's just a fun game even without the evidence.
Yeah. I hopefully will get time off to find some more threads there, but I don't think I'm going to get any time off this year because my next book has already started looming. Yeah, I was off to bed the other night thinking, I'm nearly finished Pandemonium, and said, yeah, but you got to do this now. Like, what? I'm not going to get any sleep tonight thinking about that.
That's the life. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of having time to do things, Mr. Stratton-Kent, this has been delightful. And thank you very much.
It's been a great pleasure talking to you, Gordon.
Absolutely. And I will obviously have a link to all the show notes in the show notes to the various books and so on. But, well, sir, thank you very much.
Thank you.
The State of the World, The Benefits of an Apocalypse, Itinerant Magic, The Origins of Goetia, The Personalities of the Grimoirists, you're welcome. If you like this sort of thing, and the if seems redundant there, doesn't it, then please do subscribe in iTunes, Pocket Casts, Stitcher, or on YouTube. Say hello, say your piece at runesoup.com or the RuneSoup Facebook page. Or find me on Twitter, where I am Gordon, Gordon_White, WHITE. Until next time.